Richard, I've greatly admired and learned from your work in showing the existence of God through your inferences. But I've been equally impressed by your showing that some supposed proofs of God that have been used traditionally are actually fallacies. And I'd love to hear you describe why some of these proofs that other people still use won't work.
Yes, well, let's start with the ontological argument. This was invented by St. Anselm in the 12th century, 11th century, and has been used by various other people since. In essence, it runs as follows. You can express it in the form of two premises, two things we take for granted, working to a conclusion, which is supposedly drawn out of that. It's supposed to be a deductive argument. And premise one says God is by definition an all-perfect being. That's just supposed to be a definition. Why should we object to that? And then premise two, a being which exists is more perfect than one that doesn't. One would think, well, surely if something exists, it's got more reality, it's more worth having than something that doesn't. So that seems immediately appealing. But if you grant those two premises, then it would seem to follow that God must exist, because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be all perfect. So here's a quick argument. Descartes repeated this argument, and various other philosophers have repeated this argument, but the greatest philosophers who are in favor of religion have not repeated that argument. Aquinas didn't believe it worked, and Kant didn't believe it worked. What's wrong with it? Well, I think both the premises are ones you are not justified in putting forward. It looks as if, well, God is an all-perfect being. It's just a matter of definition. But the issue is, does that presuppose the existence of God? As it were, is it saying, well, there is this object God, and what constitutes this object is being all-perfect? Or does it mean just, if there is a God, then he is all-perfect? Well, if you're not to beg the question, it must mean the second. But if it means the second, then the argument just concludes, if there is a God, then he exists, and that's not particularly worth having. The second premise is also open to question, because you can't really compare things unless you suppose them already to exist. Any comparisons presupposes the thing that both, for the sake of putting forward the proposition, assumes that both of those things exist. And then you can say one is better or bigger or worse than another one. But you can't compare things which you acknowledge one of them exists and one of them don't, because if a thing doesn't exist, it's not there to be compared with, and therefore that can't be asserted either. So neither of the premises can be asserted, and therefore the conclusion doesn't follow.
So this ontological argument, which has been used in various forms, fails as even a help in any way.
It fails totally, yes.
Okay, what about the argument from morality?
Yes, a lot of people these days are, not especially in philosophy, but certainly outside philosophy, are apt to say, well, if there wasn't a God, things wouldn't be right or wrong, and so on. So we've got to assume, and since they obviously is right and wrong, there must be a God.
Yes.
That seems to me clearly false. I don't think we would have any understanding of goodness and so on, if we didn't recognize, well, it's bad to torture children and it's a good thing to feed the hungry. If we didn't recognize these things quite apart from any suppositions that there's a God or not, we would seem to have no concept of what morality means. We wouldn't be able to grasp it. And quite clearly, atheists and theists share a lot of moral views, and they can discuss and argue about particular moral issues. Is it right to go to war in these circumstances or not in these circumstances? But that presupposes they've got a common armory of concepts which they can use to put forward their propositions and affirm or deny them. But that couldn't be the case if the very use of a moral term presupposed the existence of God. So there is a common moral understanding which doesn't depend on the existence of God. And so I don't think you can argue from morality to God. Well, the difference I think that God makes is that among our common understanding of morality is the view that we have an obligation to please our benefactors. That is to say, children have an obligation to do what their parents tell them, because their parents are so much the source of good to the children. If that's right, and surely it is right, then blowing it up a bit, if there is a God, God is so much more the source of our well-being than our parents are. He's responsible for our existence every moment of the day, and anything that our parents can do for us, God can do better. God is responsible for their being able to do that. It follows that if God wants us to do something, we have an obligation to do it. But that only follows from a general necessary truth of morality, that we have an obligation to please our benefactors, and that doesn't depend on God.
So the discontinuity between the existence of morality and its lack of capacity to infer or prove an existence of God is caused by the fact that morality has an independent, necessary existence?
Yes, indeed. That must be the case. Just whenever anything is wrong or good, there is a reason why it's good. Things can't just be good. They have to be good for some reason. Why is it bad, for example, for me to kill you? Well, because killing ends life and I can't bring you to life again. But suppose killing didn't end life. That is to say, suppose when I stick a dagger into you, you would become unconscious for 10 seconds and then you would revive again. In that case, killing wouldn't be wrong, or not very obviously wrong. So, as it were, me killing you on a particular occasion is wrong because no one has the right to take away life permanently from someone else. Right? And so any particular action being right or wrong depends on it having certain features, and any action which has those features is right, or as the case may be, wrong. There couldn't be another world which was just the same as our world, except in the respect that promise-keeping was good, and killing was good, and feeding the hungry was bad. If these things had different moral values from what they have in our world, that other world would have to be different in some other respect, e.g. in the absurd way I've suggested that killing might be different. Okay, so there are necessary truths of morality, sure, and they exist independent of God. Yes.
And so by something existing independent of God, that means that whatever that is, you cannot use that to infer the existence of God.
When things are right or wrong, they're always right or wrong in virtue of some non-moral feature that they have. For example, if it's good to give food to a certain beggar, that is because that beggar is hungry and it is good to feed the hungry. Right. If that beggar wasn't hungry, then it wouldn't be good to give food to that beggar. So any action that's right or wrong is right or wrong because of certain non-moral features, e.g. that he's hungry, which the situation has. And to take a more general example, why is it wrong to stick pins into you? Well, because sticking pins hurts. But suppose sticking pins didn't hurt, and suppose that was a conventional means of greeting, then it would be all right to stick pins in you. So the right or wrongness of particular actions depends on certain non-moral features which they have. And the world couldn't be different just in the respect that although it had all the same moral features, non-moral features, the moral features were different. Okay? But that means that there must be a necessary connection between the non-moral features and the moral features, e.g., necessarily, if someone is hungry, it is good to feed them, or necessarily, it is bad to do things which hurt people. Okay? But then, given that, these are necessary truths. Given the whole setup, it couldn't but be right to do this and wrong to do that.
And that's independent of whether God exists or not.
That is independent of whether God exists or not.
Therefore, you cannot use it to infer the existence of God.
That is right, any more than you can infer the existence from the fact that 2 and 2 make 4, because that is a necessary truth. It's true whatever the world is like, and it's true whatever the world is like that it's good to feed the hungry. It would even be true even if there weren't any hungry and there wasn't any world. It would still be true that it would be good to feed the hungry. Meaning, if there were any hungry, it would be good to feed them. And necessary truths are not evidence for anything because they hold in all circumstances whatever.